Psalm 77 can serve as a model for us when we are going through difficult times and are questioning God's presence in our lives. The psalmist honestly expresses his emotions with God, then finds comfort in recalling God's faithfulness in the past. Christians today can learn from this example that it is all right to be honest with God about our emotions, and that reflecting on God's presence in our past can remind us of His presence with us today. As Newsom phrases it, assurance and doubt can wash back and forth over the faithful. Comfort and anguish can intermingle within the same psalm as within the same speaker. The transition from anxiety to assurance in the Psalms, as in human life, is not always neatly or permanently made. Psalm 77 belongs to the broader genre of lament and is traditionally considered to have been written by Asaph. In the first 10 verses, Asaph uses the form and genre of individual lament into which the whole community can also find personal identification. Asaph expresses a great deal of distress in prayer as he cries out to God over his present troubles. The psalmist cries out to God with a sincerity of turmoil that may prove startling to those who consider prayer a tame and orderly endeavor. However, the psalmist's sincerity is crucial for a faithful lament, for the salve is spread to expose wounds, not those that are hidden from sight. This honesty is well matched with a confidence in who God is as expressed in word and deed. The movement of his prayer is from the distress of remembering to questioning God's faithfulness, and finally into a state of contemplation. This theme of crying out to God in the great distress of a darkened night is shared by many other lament psalms.
Asaph carries this theme from the very first verse, I cry aloud to God. Thus we see his lament realized in the very beginning of his psalm. Asaph's distress stems from a deeply shaken faith. His present circumstances have wrought deep pain, a suffering that he is laying open before God in prayer. The phrase immediately following his cry to God is a statement of deep conviction that God will listen to him. This statement of faith frames the whole description of his honest struggle, because Asaph is bringing these circumstances and fears into the context of who he knows God to be. Asaph describes his suffering viscerally, with comfortless soul, fainting spirit, and inability to sleep. From this sincere, raw, faith-filled place, Asaph turns his mute attention to the past, a time spent remembering his diligent search of questioning God. Throughout this weary night, Asaph expends himself in seeking God's faithfulness and the fulfillment of his promises, but comes up empty and doubtful. He is eager to know if God himself has forgotten to be merciful, if his anger has stymied his compassion. The psalmist allowed himself to be filled with self-pity. Although he was trying to pray, he was not really looking up to God, but inwardly to himself, and he was just thinking of all his troubles and disappointments. However, this introspection does not necessarily betray a rebellious spirit. Instead, Asaph's willingness to come to God, even in such a trying time, is an expression of trust in the midst of fear.
Asaph's words in verse 10 are difficult to translate because of the verb cholo, which can be translated as either to appeal or to grieve. The NIV renders the verse, Then I thought, to this I will appeal, the years when the Most High stretched out his right hand. This translation makes verse 10 a turning point in the psalmist's thoughts, as he consciously decides to shift his focus. In contrast, the NRSV renders verse 10, And I say, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. In this translation, verse 10 could be seen as a summary of the first 9 verses. As Asaph brings his suffering before God in whom he believes, he grieves because he is afraid that God has wavered and abandoned his covenant promise of goodness and unfailing love to David and his people. This translation turns verses 11 through 12 into the turning point in the psalm. Although this verse is ambiguous, both the NIV and the NRSV translation convey similar themes. In the midst of his distress, the psalmist turns to his memories of God's past actions for comfort. As we will see in the upcoming verses, the psalmist's thoughts are slowly transformed from ones of pain to ones of wonder, and finally these thoughts give way to a hymn to the God of creation. From this height of fear that God has abandoned him in the present, Asaph shifts his attention backward in time and from the self to God. Beginning in verse 11, he presses through his exhaustion and willfully recounts to himself the mighty deeds of God. Asaph's change in focus turns the lament into a hymnic style, a change so drastic that it causes some scholars to consider it to be 2 different psalm fragments entirely. However, Psalm 77 is not the only lament psalm to contain elements of praise. Furthermore, Asaph's repeated use of the verbs zakar and siach in verses 3, 6, and 11 through 12 suggests that the psalm is indeed a unified whole.
Asaph begins to reason and grapple with his problems in verses 11 through 15. In his pain, he fills his gaze with wonder as he meditates on God's character and actions in the past. Having laid bare all his needs before God, his resolve is to focus on God. As he does so, Asaph is filled again with confidence in the midst of his struggle. In verses 11-15, the psalmist attempts to re-envision the possibility of divine force working for rather than against him. He appeals to the past when he remembers God's past redemption of Israel in verse 15. Asaph's mention of God's arm restoring his people specifically recalls the Red Sea event in Exodus 15. Asaph finds great comfort in God's command over the waters in verses 16 through 18. The language used in these verses is very reminiscent of Near Eastern mythical accounts of a chaotic battle between sea gods. However, Asaph incorporates this Canaanite tradition and reframes this language by using it in the context of the Exodus story. God's power and might is clearly on display as he rules over the chaotic waters. As Asaph's imagery moves through both specific Red Sea language as well as more broad storm language in these verses, he describes the great power of God's intervention in the world in a manner in keeping with Psalm 18, 32, and 144, to name only a few. Asaph's description of God taking steps through the waters as he led his people like a flock by means of Moses and Aaron bears the truth of God's intimate presence with Israel through the otherwise chaotic and tumultuous waters. God did not lead Israel out of Egypt only to abandon them to be slaughtered by the Egyptians beside the unyielding Red Sea. Rather, he made a miraculous way of escape and accompanied them through to salvation. Furthermore, the flock language in these verses echoes the imagery of God as a shepherd in Jeremiah 23, 1-4, and Ezekiel 34.
Asaph's hymnic conclusion in verses 16 through 20 offers a demonstration of God's power in theophanic intervention. He proclaims the power and majesty of God in his hymn to the Creator as he writes hymnic praise for deliverance by God. Verses 16 through 20 contrast the disorder and chaos of God's power in nature with God's tenderness toward his people. Asaph recalls the God who worked wonders for his people in the past and testifies to himself that God is sovereign over all. Asaph realizes afresh that he need not writhe with doubts and uncertainties, for the Lord is great enough to deal with any circumstance. Asaph's sincere struggle is no sentimental journey, but a deliberate attempt to renew one's hope and courage by considering God's greatness and majesty and his special concern for his people in times past. He is a powerful example to us of lamenting faithfully. He refuses to be comforted by weightless placations and cries aloud, stretches out, remains awake in the eagerness of his seeking the Lord with his complaint. Through his exhaustion, Asaph reminds himself and God of God's faithfulness and blessings in the past and struggles to hold these truths in tension with his current turmoil. Psalm 77 reveals the psalmist's sincere struggle as he lives in the tension of both the pain of despair and the possibility of hope.
Doubtful and terrified nights often feel shameful among believers, which causes those who doubt to isolate themselves. This isolation and suppressed doubts can trap believers in self-destructive or addictive patterns as an attempt to relieve the pressure of shame. While some church teaching states, or at least implies, that faith is the word of someone who has left her fearful doubts behind, Asaph's example of holding faith and doubt together shows otherwise. Asaph is one of many strong examples in scriptures of honest struggle with remembrance. He provides an example of personal lament, which models for us how we may bring our current suffering to God. Furthermore, the act of lamenting and remembering can be used in corporate as well as individual contexts. For instance, Africans and those in the African diaspora have used psalms to lament large-scale societal problems, including colonialism, slavery, rape, lynchings, poverty, and discrimination.
Following Asaph's example of lament and remembrance could refashion a congregation's view of themselves and others in painful seasons of life. The psalmist's knowledge of God's favor, steadfast love and promises, and his grace and compassion deeply informs his struggle through doubt. In his Song in the Night, the psalmist cries out in honest pain that these attributes he knew so well have been hidden from his current experience. His cries are not of despair, but an eager longing to experience these truths of God again. As the psalmist's present circumstances have failed him, the psalmist turns to his own past, which includes that of his people, Israel, in search of evidence that God is indeed compassionate, favorable, and mighty.
We live in a time of haste and impatience. Our culture constantly looks forward to the new and updated versions of things we own or do. However, a healthy form of lament requires that we discipline ourselves to remember God and meditate on His past wonders, rather than assuming that what is novel is best. As we train our attention on God's faithfulness to us and to the church throughout the ages, our instincts of faith will sharpen. The discipline of remembering requires frequent contemplation of stories evidencing God's nature. This truth could be more practically applied to a congregation, family, or individual in this simple exercise. Choose a few attributes of God in which you find great comfort or that overturn a deep fear. Then collect examples of God acting in these ways over the next month. Big or small, anytime something reminds you of these themes, type the example, metaphor, or picture into your phone. Lastly, create a vision board, write a song or short story, or make a bullet point list of these everyday life reminders of God to you.